This happened in the summer of 2021. I was doing a solo sailing trip from Key West to the Dry Tortugas, which is about 70 miles offshore into the Gulf of Mexico. I'd done the trip twice before with my brother, but that year he had a new baby and couldn't come. So I went alone. I'm not an expert sailor by any means, but I've been on the water my whole life. I grew up in Islamorada. I know how to handle a 26-foot sloop in open water. I thought I had everything under control. The first day out was perfect. Light winds, calm swells, good visibility. I dropped anchor about 8 miles short of the Tortugas because it was getting dark and I didn't want to navigate the shoals at night. I had a cooler full of food, a working radio, a satellite phone, and a flare gun under the seat cushion. Everything was fine. I made dinner on the camp stove, drank 1 beer, and went to sleep in the cabin around 9:30. I woke up around 2 in the morning because the boat was moving differently. Not rocking, it was more like a slow, rhythmic tugging. I figured the anchor had dragged a little and we were just resettling. It happens. I checked the depth finder and the GPS, saw I was still in roughly the right spot, and went back to sleep. In the morning, I made coffee and sat in the cockpit watching the sun come up. That's when the old man on the shrimp boat noticed me. He came close enough to shout. His boat was called the Mary Elise out of Cortez, and he was running his nets in the area. He was maybe 65, weathered in the way that people who've spent their whole lives in the water get weathered. He asked where I was heading, and I told him the Tortugas. He nodded. Then he asked if I was planning to anchor out again that night. I said, probably, yeah. Still had some miles to cover. He looked at the water for a second, and then looked back at me. You want to try to make the fort by tonight, he said. Don't anchor out here after dark. Not this time of year. I asked him why. He shook his head a little, like he was deciding whether to say it. Old fishermen around here, they got a name for something that comes around in the summer. Goes back a long way. He paused. You know the old mermaid stories? The ones the Spanish sailors brought over? I told him, sure, vaguely. Those weren't love stories, he said. Those were warnings. Then his radio crackled with something, and he waved at me and throttled up and was gone. I sat there for a minute. I told myself the old man was just one of those people, the kind who's been alone on the water too long and starts to believe things. I'd heard weird local folklore my whole life growing up in the Keys. It didn't mean anything. I got underway around 9 and made good time through the morning. But around 2 in the afternoon, the wind died almost completely, and I ended up running on the motor, which burned through more fuel than I wanted. By the time I was making my final calculations, I realized I wasn't going to make the Tortugas by dark. Not safely. So I dropped anchor again about 5 miles further out than the night before, in 60 feet of water, with nothing visible on the horizon in any direction. It was fine. It was just one more night. I stayed up later than I should have, maybe trying to put off the moment of going to sleep. Around midnight, I finally went below. I heard it just after 1. It was coming from right alongside the hull. A sound I still don't have a great word for. It wasn't quite a click, and it wasn't quite a scrape. It was rhythmic and wet sounding, like something repeatedly dragging itself against the fiberglass below the waterline. slow and deliberate, once every few seconds. I told myself it was a piece of kelp caught on the anchor line. I told myself it was a sea turtle bumping against the hull, which happens. I lay there in the dark and listened and counted the sounds and tried to make it into something normal. Then it moved. Whatever it was, it traveled along the hull slowly, from the stern toward the bow. The sound changed slightly as it passed different sections of the boat. I could track it from where I was lying. It stopped directly below where my head was. I didn't move for a long time. After maybe 10 minutes, it started again. But now it was in a different place, further toward the bow, and it had been joined by a second sound. Same rhythm, different location. 2 of them. I got up. I didn't have a plan. I just couldn't lie there anymore. I went into the cockpit with my flashlight and shone it into the water. I saw nothing, just dark water. But the sounds had stopped the moment I'd moved, and that bothered me more than the sounds themselves, because it meant whatever was making them had noticed me too. I went back inside and locked the cabin door, which I know is not a real barrier against anything, but I needed to do something with my hands. The sounds started again at around 3. This time, they were different. I don't know how to describe this without sounding like I'm making it up, but it was almost vocal. Not words, not anything that close to human. But there was a quality to it that was modulated in a way that didn't feel random. A slow, low sound that rose and fell in a pattern, muffled by the water in the hole. I pressed my ear against the wall of the cabin because I couldn't stop myself. It went on for almost 20 minutes. Then it stopped, and I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I pulled the anchor before I'd even had water. I made the Tortugas in 4 hours and tied up at the dock at Fort Jefferson and sat on the boat for a long time without moving. A park ranger came by to check my permit. I don't know why, but I asked him if he'd ever heard stories about strange things in the water out in this part of the Gulf. He looked at me for a second and then said, "What kind of things?" I didn't know how to answer that. "People report stuff sometimes," he said, kind of carefully. "Usually at night. Usually solo boaters." He paused. "Usually they can't describe it." I told him I understood that. When I got back to Key West and hauled the boat, the marina guy called me over to look at the hull. Below the waterline, from roughly midship to the bow, there were long, parallel marks in the fiberglass. Not barnacle scrapes, not prop wash damage. He said he'd never seen anything quite like them and asked if I'd hit something. I said I didn't know. I sold the boat 4 months later. I told myself it was for financial reasons. I haven't been more than a few miles offshore since. I still live in the Keys, which I know probably sounds crazy, but during the day, the water here is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I just don't look at it at night anymore.